So here we have our 3 front ends. So I was saying this whole stack I'm talking about here, which is the Backbone Django stack, that's only used by part of Coursera. We also have a code base which is PHP with no framework, with no architecture, with just stuff made up by the grad students, and that's our actual code base. That's the code base that the Coursera was started by Stanford professors, and it was Stanford professors made their Stanford grad students write the prototype. So that was the code that was written by a bunch of grad students who were like, oh, I have homework to do, but I have to write this startup. Okay, go. So that was a bad idea. So yeah, that code base does not really use any of this stuff yet. So we're working on trying to modernize it, give it some sort of architecture to make it easier to develop on and not break. But in the meantime, we've been experimenting on our other front ends with the using the more modern stack, and to see how that works and try and come up with a common practice across all of our front ends. So one of the front end is www.coursera.org, and that's what you go to when you're like browsing courses and stuff like that. Another one is the admin for Coursera.org, and that's something that just admins go to when they want to contribute the content that gets shown to all the people visiting here. So we actually have 90% of our code is actually admin interfaces, because Coursera is very much based off content from universities and professors and that. So there's a lot of code that most people don't see, and that's actually what we spend a lot of our time on. So that's our admin there. And then we also have admin inside of a course itself to upload all the course materials. Most of that is using the PHP code base, but my colleagues snuck in the Backbone architecture for doing one part of it. So we're also experimenting with seeing how we can sneak in our kind of more modern stack into the older stuff. So here is www.coursera.org. And this was kind of the first, this was the first front end that we tried using a modern stack for. Like basically they made the PHP code base, and that was how you took classes, but then they needed Coursera.org for browsing classes. So that was the next front end. And this was originally built by my colleague Laith. And so he decided, okay, I'll experiment with Backbone. Everybody likes Backbone. Let's try it out. But this was his first time using Backbone, and he was also trying to use it with a non-existent API. So at the time, we really didn't have APIs. We had APIs that like spat back HTML. We had very non-RESTful APIs. But he decided to try Backbone anyway. So we have a few models in this code base for courses and universities and users. Now on our models, so here's an example of the topic model. And here you actually see that we don't do anything the Backbone way at all. So they're saying like you don't have to do things that RESTful way. So we don't specify a URL. And what we have instead is we have this sync function, and this is a function that we made up completely ourselves. And sync will take a callback, and it will go and do coursera.api.get, calling to our API URL, and then when it's done, it will set the model with the data, and otherwise we error. So we had to write this because we don't have a RESTful API powering this site right now. So we're like, okay, we'll just write our own function, and then when we want this information in other places, we'll call it topic.sync. So this is an example of how you don't actually have to do things a Backbone way. Ideally, one day we'll make this more Backbone-y, but we have a PHP code base to fix, so not going to happen. We also have collections. And once again, the same thing on the collections is that we don't do the URL. Instead, we specify this retrieve function, and the retrieve will call the API and then add back all the data that we get back. So then we just know elsewhere when we want this data, we have to call topics.retrieve, right? We can't do the new topics, topics.fetch, since we haven't used the Backbone way.
I noticed you use a callback there instead of firing an event that reviews can handle.
Is there like a reason for that?
Yeah.
No, I think the reason is just that this is how we came up with it first. I think if we were going to redo this, because one thing we're doing here is we're defining sync and defining retrieve. You can also, like, if you don't want to use the Backbone way of doing things, you have other options besides going completely the other way. You could specify what function is going to parse back the response that you get. You could specify what function is going to come up with the URL. So this is not the only way of overriding Backbone. This is kind of like the worst way of doing it, since we're not really taking advantage of much of anything. So yeah, so we just decided to do that callback, but you could also do an event. We do use comparator, which is just a way of sorting. But sorting in Backbone is kind of tricky, because what we find is that we often want, like in one view I want to sort models collection this way, in the other view I want to sort models the other way. So I've stopped using comparator, and now I just have functions that are, say, like return courses sorted by time, return courses sorted by open, etc. So I don't love the way sorting works in Backbone. Using Backbone doesn't mean I love it, by the way. But it's better than nothing. And then we have our views. So we've got lots of views. We split up into different folders, and all of them extend most of them extend the body view, which means that they all kind of share the same HTML for what's around them. So this is an example. We have, that's like our header view up there, and then this is the catalog body extending the body view, and then inside there we're just rendering templates for each of the models in the topics collection that we get back.
Are you running the client side?
Yes, yes.
Are you using underscore templates?
We are using, we're using Jade and Stylus. So Jade and Stylus, Jade is like this bracketless templating language, which has full logic in it. You literally just put your JavaScript inside there, which some people may not like if you're, a template should have no logic kind of person. But our templates have shit tons of logic, I'll admit. It's life. Not perfect. So we use Jade for our templates and Stylus for our CSS. And Stylus also has no punctuation in it. So we have very little punctuation in our code base. We do use semicolons in our JavaScript, though, because that's just insane. Yeah, but you can mix and match other things. We actually, in another code base, my colleague uses Jade with handlebars, because he likes the Jade lack of brackets. Jade is also whitespace significant. So you in order to make a structure, you'd say div ul.li, and it would automatically do your output the start and the end tags. So that's pretty cool, because you don't have to keep track of your start and your end tags. That's I think the best thing about it. So he liked that part, but he also likes the handlebars approach to logic and helpers. So he mixes Jade and handlebars. So we try and make it so that our build tool works with all of these, right? And Backbone doesn't care which templates you use. It's up to you. Cool. And then we have our router. So this is an example route, right? Going to your course records page. And it looks kind of long, and we've got the semicolon pyramid going on here. But we check to see if the user is authenticated, because if not, we want to navigate them back to home. And that's using the Backbone navigate. And what we normally do is sometimes in some of the routes we'll actually try and get the data first, and we don't load that region until we get that data back. In other routes, we'll load in the view, and then the view will go and fetch the data. So it's just a design decision for each of them. But most of that code there is just the region specifying, so it's really not actually as complicated as it looks. Okay, so that's Coursera.org. Now here's the admin. And the admin actually shares the header that we saw before, but basically it's just changing this section here, and it has its own set of routes and views and models and all that. So here for our models. So in admin, this is what I wrote a few months ago when I came, and I was like, okay, I want to try and do this in a really backbone-y way, right? And I was also basing it off Django admin. So any of you guys used Django admin before? What's your backend written in, by the way? PHP? Nice. It's not, I mean, I like PHP because I can just guess syntaxes and they all work. So I just sit there going like, all right, I'm going to take this syntax from JavaScript and this one from Python. I'm like, oh, sweet, PHP supports it, awesome. Yeah, so Django admin is just the thing that's built into Django for automatically creating this admin interface for administering models. So we were doing Django admin because we had this Django backend, but I really didn't like how Django admin tied together presentation and data, and I didn't like how dependent it would make us on Django, because one day eventually you might want to move off of Django, move off of PHP, and move to some Haskell or whatever is cool. So I like the idea. Generally, my approach to things is you have your APIs outputting JSON, and then you have your front ends consuming those, and you just keep them separate, because that way you can test them separately, and that way you can also present multiple front ends to that same data, and that way if you need to change your backend stack, that's fine, you can do it, just run your tests across the new stack, right? And you don't have to change everything. So that to me seems like the best approach to things if you're not sure about your back end, and if you're not sure about your front end, because we're really not sure about anything. So I think that's the best approach. But I am somewhat sure about JavaScript. I think we're going to have JavaScript for a while, so I'll stick with it. So here I try to be very proper. So we have admin model, which extends Backbone model, and then we have a bunch of model classes that extend that. Again, really. And then even staff admin model has 3 classes subclassing that. And that's just so they can share a set of methods and properties. So admin model, it extends Backbone model and then adds all these other functions. And these are really just things that help me figure out how to create a form for a model, because my goal was to just be able to easily create forms to edit different models, and if somebody suddenly wanted to edit something else in our database, I wouldn't have to reinvent the whole thing. I could just define the model and it would just work. So that was my goal, and that's very similar to the way Django admin works, and probably a lot of automatic admins work. So I will admit that this means that I'm kind of mixing presentation into my model, but whatever. That's life. So we have field sets. That's kind of the really essential one, where I define all the fields that are editable on this model, and for each one of them I'll say what type it is, whether it's a checkbox or a drop down and stuff like that. And then there's a few other things as well. So this is an example of the staff admin model. So our field sets is just the array of options, and then in the views, so this view right here, this is my model admin page view. This model admin page view actually will iterate through all of the properties that are in that field sets, and it'll figure out it'll actually use a different view for each of them. So these are all nested views. So if it said type checkbox banner, I'm going to append a checkbox banner view and fill it in based off whatever the value of that model attribute is at that time. So then I end up making this very long form. So this form actually has 100 fields in it. But each of them are just views that correspond to that thing, right? So it's definitely doing a lot of nested views, but it's really easy, because if I want to add another field to it, it's very simple, right? Yes?
You mentioned that form is really long. What if you wanted to render it as the page was scrolling down? Would that be really difficult?
No, I would just have some logic in there to render it. I do that for the course. Well, for the course catalog, I render the images on demand. So I do that a different way. I just kind of keep the source attribute and a data attribute and check this window scroll. If you're worried about the DOM, so I guess you're worried about there being too much DOM, right? So you could decide to just check where you were, check what's supposed to be visible, and then append or remove those things on demand.
Are you doing validation both on the client and the server in this case, or are you?
Yeah, so for validation, actually for this one, I am validating basically only on the server, because the save is very fast. So there's a save button here that's actually floating, so you can save all the time. And so if there's an error, if you specify a short name that's not unique, you'll get back the response, and I automatically highlight the field and all that. So my error response is name error, etc. So I'll automatically highlight, jump to it, etc. So for this one, I'm not doing too much validation on the client. If there's feedback that we need validation on the client for something, I'll just go and put it in the view. So one option for these is instead of doing views, I could have just done templates. But some of these things, like, for a checkbox or for a text field, right? I don't need JavaScript there. I could have just done a template. But some of these you really do need JavaScript for, like select to view that uses the select to search widget. And there's a bunch of other ones as well that do actually use some JavaScript. So I used views so that I could both have the template, but also if I needed it, I could have some JavaScript as well. So if I was going to have validation stuff, I would put it inside the view for each of the types. Yeah. But yeah, I mean, you start, I guess, yeah, I'd say like you got to start with the validation on the server and then bring it to the client. You don't want to have the reverse because stuff will happen. And it's actually like I found out after putting it out that the permissions on this interface is really important because we're subject to FERPA laws, which is like who can access student data, because if the permissions aren't right on this, then people could accidentally access students' data and then people get really mad. So it was really important when I was doing the API behind the scenes for this that I tested all of those different things. So the API is very, very thoroughly tested for this now. It's probably the most tested thing that we have because it's so, an admin API is so kind of important. Cool, and so this also, the site admin models and collections use the very RESTful way of doing things. So all of them actually have the URLs defined, just like we saw in the original example. So that means like when you create a new instructor, it'll do, or when you get an instructor, get instructor/2, it gives back the JSON, and it's very RESTful. So universities, behind the scenes in MySQL, that's a many field, right? So that would be a bunch of associated universities. So we just passed down an array where the university is represented by the ID. And then when you save it back, if you add another one, it'd be like 2, 5. So this is very RESTful because if we were doing this API, like in our other front end, universities would probably return back a JSON that actually described the universities. And that would be it's somewhat more optimal, right, in terms of not having to do an additional fetch for the data, because I do another fetch to fill in the names of it. But for the admin interface, I can afford to be suboptimal since it's not has millions of users. So I went for this this very RESTful way of doing things. So everything is done using this REST API, and so behind the things in Django, all I have is I just have one general view class, which handles get, put, post, and delete for any model that it's associated with. And then for all of the things like instructor and course and stuff like that, they just extend that view and they just say, oh, this is the model I want to be associated with. And if there's any special validation, I'll define it there as well. But it means I can share logic across things. So the other day, there's a lot of people requesting to have a history, like a change log of stuff. So all I did was created a new, table in our database, and then in that general admin API view, I just extended the put and the post and the delete to save something into the admin changelog table every time something happened, right? So I only had to add like a few lines of code to that in order to add that logging. So it's really cool when you can actually come up with a REST API for stuff because you can generalize it and it's easy to add stuff like that. So we'll certainly need our non-RESTful stuff for some things, but it's good to start with this. We also have collections, and collections just have a few things on them. So you can see a collection here for like courses. So here you see the URL is admin/courses. We also have some human rateable labels there. And then those get passed into collection views. So these are just views for checking out all the different models, and they have some filter controls and stuff like that. But most of the stuff is in those model views. And then there's the router. And the router is very much like the other one. The only difference is that I also have this get allowed collections. So I do check people's cookie just to see on the admin dashboard what collections they should even have access to at all. But if for some reason like they did see collections when they clicked on them, if they didn't have access to them, it would be enforced on the server that they didn't have access. So this is just meaning that you're not going to see links to stuff that you can't view and you can't edit. So I do a little checking there which does kind of duplicate logic. I think what I could do is I could actually have an API that would return back, these are the collections that a user has access to, and I could do it that way if I wanted to have kind of the same logic on the server and the client for that. But it's been okay to just do it in the client for now and just checking their cookie and the ACL and the cookie. Cool. So finally, not as long on this one, but this is the course admin. So I was saying this is one where everything around this is the PHP code base. But this here, he's just managed to replace this whole body here with his Backbone code. And this is the course admin for updating lectures and assignments. And so this is pretty similar to site admin, but one thing special he does. So one thing he does is he uses Backbone Relational. So Backbone Relational is a library that you can plug into Backbone, which helps you when you have relationships between models, so that when something comes in, it'll fill in the other model, right? So in this one, he has section, and a section has many items. An item itself is another Backbone model. And so his API, in my API in site admin, I would have just returned back IDs for the items. His API actually returns back an array of objects where every one of those is a full item JSON. So what he does is use Backbone Relational and say, okay, the key is going to be items. So it has many relation. The related model is item. Related collection is items. And then when this section is fetched and it sees the items key, it knows to turn each of those into an item model. So this is cool, and it's a different way. If you have a lot of relational data, a different way of dealing with it. It can get a little weird sometimes if you have like one thing that's pointing, like, so we have on www.coursera.org, I tried using Backbone Relational, but on Coursera.org we have topics that have universities. So there's one API that returns back a list of topics and the full universities. We have another API that returns back universities with the full topics. And it turned out being I think it was almost impossible to use Backbone Relational because of the order of loading the JavaScript for it, because this had to know about this and this had to know about this, and weird stuff happened.
And does it fetch those lazily so you have the n+1 problem, or does it try to? I assume the RESTful API wouldn't let you just bulk retrieve all the.
So this API, when whatever the URL it hits up, like quizzes, that URL will return back a list of the quizzes, and each of them would have items in it and would have a full list underneath it. Yeah, yeah. So it's just the way that they created this API that it returns back full, like you say, like expanded, right? Like expanded relational objects. Another thing that it's interesting that this does is that it does partial update. So partial update actually means that when he does a save, instead of saving everything, it just goes and sends the changed attributes to the server. So Backbone is saying, like, Backbone keeps track of what's attributes you've changed. So at any point you can ask model.change attributes and it'll tell you which one's changed. So what he does is that when he does a save, he's actually only sending the stuff that changed to the server, and he's actually using an HTTP patch for that. Then the server knows that it's only going to save that stuff in the model. So that's pretty cool, because it also means that you're less likely to accidentally override stuff that you didn't mean to, right? Because you're just being very explicit about what stuff you're saving. So I think I would do that if I was going to redo my stuff, because it is really scary knowing that at any moment some random university professor is in your admin and tweaking buttons, and you don't know what's going to happen. So I put in a lot of protections to now make sure that nothing is saved that isn't supposed to be saved. When we first had it, especially with relational models, it's really easy to accidentally override your relations. So we had our courses, where they're related to instructors and TAs and stuff like that, but they were also related to our students model. So that was kind of our enrolled students. And I didn't realize this, and accidentally was sending an empty array for students, which would then unenroll everybody that was in the course. Didn't realize this locally because I didn't have any students enrolled. But then when it went live, and somebody saved one of these guys, it accidentally unenrolled 70,000 students. Luckily we had a backup, so it was okay, right? That's the advantage of having redundant databases everywhere. So we just restored everything, but yeah, as a general thing, like patching, doing partial updates, that can be a little safer approach, but also just making really sure that you're only saving the stuff that you intended to be saved. So now in my API behind the scenes, I have an explicit list of fields that get saved on every model. And I also even have a notion of protected fields. And a protected field means that if the field used to be filled in and is no longer, it'll actually error and say, uh-oh, this went from something to nothing. And I added that in because then I realized that this site admin was actually a collaborative interface, and that there were sometimes there were multiple people using it at a time. And I wanted to make sure that somebody didn't open it and then somebody opened it at the same time and they overrode it. So this was like a very blunt approach to making sure people didn't accidentally lose data, right? It's very important not to lose data. I'm sure you guys are very aware of that, probably much more than I am. Yeah, there's certainly fancier things I could have done for collaborative editing, but I didn't really realize till it was live that it was a collaborative interface. So that's something good to know. Yeah.
Just so I understand that, does that mean when you have a form, do you have like an on-change listener, and then when they change something, you update the model?
So the way I do it, you could do it that way. The way I do it for site admin is that when you click the save button, that's when I go through. So I'll go through every one of those field sets, check to see if they changed, and then set them in the model. I could call that on change as well. But instead, what I do on change is I just enable the save button so that they can save. But if for some reason I needed the model to be updated at any point, I could do that. Cool. Okay, so that's kind of our front ends and different ways that we're using Backbone. We're also testing it. Just in the last few days, we actually got tests working for our Backbone views, and we're using Sign-on.js and Mocha. It's pretty cool that we can now test our views, and we're also using JS DOM, so you can actually load in a view, you can mock out the AJAX and the JSON that comes back, and you can check that the rendered output actually has some bit of HTML that you're expecting, and all that stuff. So that's really important that we got that working, because it's really cool doing everything in JavaScript, because it means having all your presentation in one place instead of splitting your presentation across the server and the client. But it's also really dangerous, because if you have all your logic in, or all your presentation and even presentational logic in JavaScript, then it's so easy to, JavaScript's a crazy language, right? It's really easy to accidentally, break something and not find out about it until a user actually tries it. So because of that, it's really important to actually come up with a testing strategy for that. So I'm glad that we do have a testing strategy for it, because now I can go forward with more confidence doing this whole Backbone-based architecture, because I know that I can actually test the stuff that happens. So yeah, so we're using Backbone. It's pretty good. It's worked well enough. It's not perfect, but most frameworks are never going to work perfectly for what you're doing, because most people make a framework because it's the perfect thing for what they're doing, and then some of them become more popular because they're generic enough to be used by other people. But there's definitely other frameworks out there, like Ember and Angular, which we checked out, and Angular is actually pretty cool looking. So try it out, see if you like it. I started by trying to do something very Backbone-y, and that helped me understand how it was supposed to be. But then when going to other stuff, I can see, okay, how should we best modify it for our other situation? Yeah, cool. I think that's it. Keep your options open. Ta-da. All right, thank you. Any more questions? Yeah.
So you have all your templates being rendered on the front-end side. So when a Google crawler comes along, it sees your page, your home page, and it's not going to execute in JavaScript, does it see a blank page?
Good question. So I have that. JS. There. So what we do is we pre-render for bots, and I have I think a diagram of that here. What about bots? Okay, so we pre-render for bots. So we use, what are we using? Oh, we're using Selenium now to do the pre-rendering. And so we have a script that goes through every page that needs to be visited by bots, renders it, and then when a bot visits, we have a configuration rule in our Nginx that serves them the pre-rendered HTML. So that works pretty well, and the most important thing is, of course, for Facebook, you got to have your horse photo correct. Yeah, and so that's now just part of our build process. Yeah, works fine.
The event handling framework, like when you fetch a model, I mean, like on our app, sometimes we grab an item and we want to do one thing to it, and sometimes we want to do another thing to it. Like, would you just have to have like a big event handler with a bunch of ifs in there to figure out what you want to do when you load it? Like,
oh, because you want different responses.
is it locked like whenever you fetch a model, execute the script, or?
Well, you could. I mean, I guess you could set the event handler before you did it and then reset it afterwards. That would be one approach.
It's like a callback. A callback's a nice place to do that. After I make this request, I want to.
Yeah, well, you could just say on change, bind this like handle change, and then you'll pass in. Why don't you just your handle change function? You'll just pass in another callback there, right? And then handle change will just say, call this callback. I think that's the way I would do it.
Can you make your own events and listening and stuff like that? Like you have, on uploader.
Yeah, you can make your own events as well. So Backbone just has the generic event system. So it's a Backbone. So Backbone docs aren't really good for intro, but they're okay for looking at this stuff. So events, you can trigger custom named events and all that stuff.
And then
yeah.
you can have anybody subscribe to those events.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
I've noticed that some web applications will notice when their JavaScript is out of date if you have a long-running application, and will tell you to refresh the page to get the latest. And continue using it. Does Backbone support anything like that?
I don't think it has anything built in. Like Backbone, pretty much everything that's built in is what you'll see here, which really isn't that much, right? The models, the collections, the router, history. So we've actually thought about that, but then we changed our caching and it wasn't an issue. But what we do is that we just we compile the JavaScript based off the Git hash of the deploy, and that's what gets loaded in. And so as long as they've gotten the latest home.html, then it'll pull in that JavaScript. So I guess the approach could be there, if we were going to do that, then it'd be like, okay, if you had Coursera.org open for 5 days, and we could ping, so you'd have to have some service that would respond back and say whether there was new JavaScript available, right? So I'm not sure if you'd bake that service into your API or just check for the existence of because we do it based on Git hashes, right? So you wouldn't know what the next Git hash was. So yeah, Backbone doesn't have that built in. We thought about it, but then we just changed our cache headers so that it wasn't as big of a deal. So can't remember what our cache headers is. We host our JavaScript off CloudFront now, so we configure stuff there. So our build process will actually go out and push all the JavaScript to CloudFront, and then we just reference it from CloudFront. And we can do that all via require.js. In require.js, it just specifies a base URL for everything. So when we're on prod, that just loads from CloudFront.
What's the largest, we're working with collections here, what's the largest collection that you've tried? And did you see any notable performance hit to the browser?
So our largest collection is the TAs, and that is 800 models, but 800 models that are fairly small. And I did not see any noticeable hit to the browser there. I have people certainly have. I went to a talk about Marionette where people were talking about when their Backbone collection is getting too big, having a problem there. So you could paginate or something like that, or you could decide to not pass down as much of the JSON, right, and then fill in parts of the JSON as well, right? Because I probably don't need to send down as much JSON as I do for that that collection view. because all I need is like the table and the name and a few columns. So if that becomes an issue, I could do that, or I could just paginate the UI or infinite scroll the UI, or one of those standard things. Yeah, but generally DOM performance, I find that DOM performance is more of an issue than JavaScript performance. Although I do know I was testing Coursera in IE6 the other day, or in IE7. It doesn't really work very well. In IE7, you actually do get a script hanging alert, and I profiled it, and but I haven't tracked down exactly where it is. But I mean, the number of people we have on IE7 is tiny. So now what I've done is I just have a message that says you need to upgrade, right? Because I don't want them to have that bad experience or use Chrome Frame. So in older browsers with not as good JavaScript stuff, I don't know if that was a Require.js issue or a Backbone issue, but that could be an issue there, yeah. Cool. Okay, thanks.